What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Redfall, the open-world FPS action-adventure recently released from Arcane Studios. And as it is a few days post-launch here, we already know that the game has had a rough start, to put it nicely, and naturally we'll be getting into a lot of that over the course of this review. But first and foremost, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that I cover, there is a video linked in the description below. And last but not least, while I did not get a review copy of this game, I did receive a copy of it for free from a promotion with NVIDIA. After recently upgrading my graphics card, they were bundling it with free copies of this game, which I held on to in case I didn't get a review copy. Which brings us to the now. But as I already mentioned, Redfall is an open-world FPS action-adventure that can be played in co-op with friends or entirely single-player, whatever you want to do there, though it is always online required, though it's my understanding they're working on changing that. Broadly speaking, I would say Redfall is a game that has a lot of fun concepts with systems that kind of fail to hit the actual mark. Personally, I don't think the game is as meritless as a lot of people are making it out to be. However, it does absolutely have some pretty glaring issues in the game design, with what I would consider the worst of them being something that could be addressed, which we'll talk about over the course of the review. As with all newer games, I do like to start them off with a section talking about the technical state of the game. Now, in terms of performance, everything seems pretty fine. I use a very high-end computer to record footage and everything for reviews, so admittedly my experience is not necessarily representative of everyone's. Even still, after going through reports on the performance outside of just my own, it seems that very few people are having much in the way of trouble of actually running this title, with my only personal experience in that regard being that some of the more densely populated areas, so to speak, such as the actual town areas of the island, the game would stutter a little bit, which is about the only problem I personally encountered. However, beyond the performance of the title, there are what I would consider some bugs with game mechanics, such as enemies constantly getting stuck on terrain or struggling with pathfinding or sort of bugging their way downstairs, alongside some jankier animations. And those things, I suppose, technically work, but visually it looks a bit off, frankly. So definitely keep that in mind. From there, I want to talk about difficulty as well as New Game Plus. So when it comes to picking difficulty, initially there are 3 of them available: Daylight, Dusk, and Midnight, or easy to hard essentially, and this largely determines how much damage enemies do. After you beat the game for the first time, you'll unlock a new difficulty called Eclipse as the game forces you into New Game Plus, which is my first complaint I would say here, is that there is no option for New Game Plus. Once you beat the game, you're forced into New Game Plus. The next time you load it up or start again, the game just starts over from the beginning with all your gear and everything still accumulated, which is certainly a decision, I suppose, but it is odd to me that they did not let you freely explore the island after beating all of the missions, as opposed to just forcing you into the next playthrough, let's say. Though when that happens for you, if you get that far, all of your progress in terms of equipment, levels, collectibles, etc., all that is kept. However, world progression, so to speak, like main story as well as unlocking safe houses, etc. out in the world, will be reset. Now, from there, we're going to pick one of 4 characters. It's my understanding they're planning on adding more later. However, currently, we have a choice between Jacob, Rini, Layla, and Devinder. And what this choice is actually doing for you outside of the aesthetic look of each character is purely their 3 active skills. Each of them has 3 skills associated with them that will change your playstyle up slightly. Beyond that, however, they are the same in all respects in terms of gameplay. What it does have an effect on is the story, which brings us naturally to the story setup. As I'm sure you've seen on screen and are probably well aware, the story of Redfall centers around the island of Redfall being slowly taken over by vampires, and by the time people noticed, it was too late. The game starts in an attempted evacuation, or I should say right as one failed, as the vampires have essentially pulled the tide back from the island, making it untraversable, as well as causing the sun to go black, allowing them to be out and about. Our job is to get to the bottom of this, understand what happened, and naturally try to put an end to that. That's about as much as I want to go into in terms of just complete spoilers. However, there are nonetheless some broad strokes things that I want to say about the story. I think the story is good, but it's not told particularly well. Both the concept at play here as well as the events that transpire during the story and the lead up to it are all very interesting, but I don't think it's presented to the player in a very good way, because a lot of it is done through static cutscenes. Now, these cutscenes are a tiny bit unique depending on which character you're playing, as what your character says and their reaction to them will change these cutscenes quite a bit, but the cutscenes themselves are static images that play basically every time you fire up the new story mission. Because initially, we'll clear out a hub to sort of work out of, and then from there, every time we are ready to progress the story, we go start the next story mission, which triggers this cutscene, and that's pretty much all it does, as even after this, you're not obligated to go start that mission or anything. It just opens it up to where you can go complete those objectives now. However, these static cutscenes aren't exactly what you would expect from something with a full AAA budget, so I have some guesses as to why this probably is, but it doesn't change the fact that this is a little underwhelming, frankly. Now, as to why I think they did this, I think it comes down to two things. One, I don't think they wanted to have to make each of these cutscenes 4 separate times for each character, as seeing these properly animated, so to speak, would see each character potentially moving differently, which leads to a lot of extra work, and they probably tried to cut that cost here. But again, for a AAA game, it just looks bad. The other side of that is that when you get up close and personal on various character models in game, the one you can actually talk to, you can tell that they don't really have a system in place to make that look good, as while most of the character models and everything are fine in combat, when you're actually up close and talking to someone, you can see that the quality is, again, not up to really what you would expect from a AAA title. However, we're not done there, because the other part of the story, I would say some of the background to what happened and how we got here, is explained through collectibles. There are 100 of them, they're called grave locks, they're all technically from one person, and every time you pick one up, you'll get a little more information about the lead up to what happened. And on a personal note, I really don't like when games keep what I would consider key story information behind side things like that. That should have been the kind of thing that was explored in the main story, and it just isn't. And while everything about that is interesting, it's an interesting story, it's just weird to me that it wasn't included in the main story, which leads to me feeling like the story of this title is very intriguing, but it's not told particularly well through game mechanics, which to my mind is a bummer. Next up, I want to talk about progression systems for this game. They're all relatively simple, and I would say there's primarily 2 of them, which can be divided up into leveling as well as equipment. As you complete quests, take on vampires and other enemies like cultists, you can level up potentially to a max of 40. Every time you level up, this is going to give you 1 skill point to spend on your various skill trees. These are divided up into more utility-oriented things that pretty much every character gets, like extra ammo carry capacity, etc. Every character also has an upgrade path available for each of their main skills, and these increase in cost slowly as you go up, but these are all just flat benefits to your skills, so because of this, there's not a ton of variation in what each character is able to do, outside of occasionally 1 or 2 of these abilities affecting the group and not just you. And overall, I would say while this is fine, it doesn't really make each character feel unique by any means. Then we have the equipment system. We're going to be picking up a lot of weapons as well as remnants, and it's important to note that weapons as well as enemies scale to you as you're leveling up, which means that upgrading your weapons to level appropriate things is very important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the combat section. However, it's important to know that in terms of weapons, it does have a level associated with each weapon, and that while the weapons themselves, for the most part, are all of a few different varieties, so each shotgun will have a few different variations, assault rifles have a few different variations, etc. The level attached to it is probably more important than the rest of it. However, the weapons themselves also come in various rarities, which are common to Unrivaled. Unrivaled effectively being uniques, but even these have levels associated with them. That means eventually you're going to be upgrading and changing them around, which means that the equipment system isn't wildly unique. You're just mostly throwing things away as you find new and higher level things. And I think this would have felt a little better if they honestly just did something like remove the level from the Unrivaled items, make the Unrivaled items scale to whatever you're doing, and maybe provide a unique set benefit so that finding them doesn't feel like it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day it's just a leveled piece of gear like everything else, which would just be a suggestion to make that system a little more interesting. Though in terms of its function, yeah, it's fine. And while we're on the topic of progression systems, while not super relevant to every situation, if you're playing this in co-op, there's what they call a trust system in place, where as you play with more and more characters, it'll increase your trust, which gives you a combat effectiveness buff, which is supposed to incentivize you to keep playing together without someone wandering off. Because in co-op, you can move completely separately of each other. There's no like distance limit or anything like that. So the trust system is built with that in mind. Next up, I want to talk about the big thing with this particular game, and it is combat. Combat, I think, is where the game drops the ball. A lot of the other systems, some that we're going to get to that I actually enjoyed, have things that are minor by comparison at the very worst. But combat is in a rough place. However, I still think there's a lot to talk about, and I don't think it's all bad. Mostly, I do think things here could be fixed, and if I was Arcane, fixing this would be my top priority. So let me start at the beginning here and say that everything your character does in combat feels pretty great. Movement as well as playing around with the various weapons all feels really good. The weapons feel varied and unique. You can have up to 3 equipped at a time. They all have their various ammo types. Some of them are effective on vampires versus human enemies, etc. There's enough variation there to make that part of it feel great. With my only real complaint on the character side of things being that of the 4 characters you can play as, they just don't feel that unique from each other in terms of gameplay. However, where things take a much different turn is when you're talking about enemies. As I'm sure you've probably heard online by now, some enemies can be basically just very easy to walk around. And while that's certainly true at the beginning of the game, I also don't think that simple explanation tells the full story. See, because I reviewed Arcane's previous game, Deathloop, and if you remember, there was this exact same conversation around that game, and enemies just being very stupid. However, in that game, as you complete objectives and make your way towards breaking the loop, enemies would start scaling up and become more aggressive and more intelligent because they were deliberately handicapped at the beginning to ease you into the game. So knowing that, I went into this combat, which is, again, incredibly easy and has that exact same problem towards the beginning, very curious if that changed. And it does. As you level up and start completing more and more of the story, enemies start scaling up, dealing more damage, becoming more aggressive, attacking you in greater numbers. However, this isn't a catch-all solution either because, for starters, this does make the initial impressions of enemies not great, because the fact is you can walk circles around them at the beginning for a good little while. Eventually, I find that the game tends to migrate to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you'll start getting killed from off screen because enemies are dealing so much damage all of a sudden that you're dead before you even see what hit you. Enemies are also prone to one-shotting you, especially some of the various different kinds of vampire in the late game. They can just get a lucky hit and kill you outright. And while death isn't really a big deal, you just reset at the last safe house or fast travel marker you were at, it can kind of get annoying very quickly, and much of combat tends to be one of those two extremes, which is further complicated by your own weapons and the level scaling. If you don't regularly upgrade your weapons to something level appropriate, you're going to find that you're not dealing a lot of damage, which makes finding a playstyle that you enjoy something that's a little bit difficult because you're likely to be constantly cycling out weapons as a result of this. So my main point for the combat section, though we do still have more to talk about here, is that the combat at the beginning of the game makes a bad first impression, and then as you play the game, it makes a switch to the opposite end of the spectrum where you're just being killed almost immediately and you don't even know what happened. And I find that especially frustrating because that was one of the biggest complaints about Arcane's last game, Deathloop, where you could just walk circles around the enemy at the beginning of the game. And it's weird to me that they didn't take any steps to address that here, which I would say makes this my biggest complaint about this game. But nonetheless, we're not done. Still a few more things to talk about. Mostly in combat, you're going to be fighting human cultists or various types of vampires. The vampires themselves come in various, I would say, classes. There's the basic vampire enemies, but then there's also ones that do extra stuff, such as siphons, who will slowly steal your health, or the shrouds, who will reduce your vision, etc., etc. The problem with all the vampire models is that you see a lot of repeat models. The special vampires pretty much all look the same. A shroud looks like a shroud. They don't even change the face of these characters. And the base model vampires have like 4 or 5 variations variations, but you're going to see a lot of the exact same ones. And I really feel like they should have done something to at least mix up the faces of these guys, because in an FPS where you're constantly in the enemy's face, it's just very weird to keep seeing the same face over and over again, and a little more variation here would go a long way. This is less noticeable with the human enemies because honestly they die so fast and there's so many different types of cultists that there is actually a lot of variation for the human enemies, who even have little, I would say, classes, so to speak, where different ones will do different things as well, but they usually die so fast it's not a big deal. Though we are still not done yet, because the last thing I want to talk about in terms of combat is the enemy pathfinding. Regardless of everything I just said about how enemies behave, how that scales, etc., one thing that remains a constant problem is that enemies seem to have a lot of trouble pathfinding to you. For bigger enemies, they seem to rely on this sort of teleport ability to keep from getting stuck. Various vampires can teleport around you a little bit, which I would say is almost a necessity for them because they're constantly getting stuck on terrain or having trouble pathfinding through various buildings, and it's obvious enough to clearly be a problem, and I think it makes the other issues with things like enemy AI even more apparent, but it does look like, to me, this is a separate issue. Because I started testing it after a while, and it is incredibly easy to get enemies stuck on things like cars, etc., where they'll just keep running into a car trying to get to you, like they're not even registering that there's an object there. Now, vampire enemies can, after a while, teleport to a different location, and that sort of fixes it, but enemies don't. But things like human enemies don't really have that option. And for all of those reasons, combat does not feel great, but I also don't think it's broken to the point of it being unfixable. Simply put, if they were to tighten up combat and fix a lot of the issues I just listed, I actually think it would be pretty fun and playable, because what you, the character, can do is fun. It's just hampered by enemies that either can't keep up or kill you in one hit from off screen, and those two extremes simply aren't fun to engage with. And to my mind, if they fixed combat, they would be fixing the bulk of this game's problems, though it would certainly still have some. And that brings us to our world and gameplay section. As I mentioned, this game is open world, but it is divided into two open world sections. Once you move on to the first, you can't go back, and then once you enter New Game Plus, you'll have to work your way through the first again to get to the second. So do keep that in mind. There's a couple points of no return there, so you might want to try to do everything before you move on if you care about that kind of thing, which, for the people who are constantly asking me to explain my 100% process, in this case it was pretty straightforward. Doing just the story and the safe house missions, which we'll get to, will take you to 80% of the game, with everything else just being down to making sure you explore every bit of the world before moving on to the next section, as things like collectibles, etc. will be locked off if you do that otherwise. But each of these open world sections is divided up into neighborhoods. Each neighborhood has a safe house that will provide you a bit of extra side content, with what are known as safe house missions, which are not to be confused with side quests. We'll get to those. Safe house missions are 2 missions per neighborhood, where you work to defeat the mini-boss of the area, known as the underboss, and collect their skull. Some of this is mandatory for story progression, but the safe house missions themselves are very undercooked. It is one of a few missions at the first start, so the first tier for every safe house is just a sort of almost random mission to either go break up a rally or go collect some supply drops, etc. It's just one of a few various types of missions, and then the second mission for each safe house is always to go kill the mini-boss, which is just go to location, kill the mini-boss. And the game could really use some more variation there. It's not completely without merit, but you can really tell that they didn't really anticipate people doing all of these because they just repeat very much so. Now, side quests, on the other hand, are unique adventures that actually give you something to do content-wise, and a few of these are interesting, but there's just not a lot of them. Full-fledged side quests, there's like maybe 10, and while the ones that are here are good, there's just not enough of them. Then, however, we have vampire nests. Eventually, after a little ways into the story, you'll start seeing vampire nests pop up. These are essentially like little mini dungeons. They have an area of effect out in the world, and any vampires in that area will be buffed up and made harder to kill, as well as deal more damage, all while you try to find the entrance to said nest, the nest being a sort of psychic manifestation of the vampires. Inside the nest, you can either stealth or fight your way to the end, where you have to destroy the nest heart. It's possible to do this stealthily and never really fight anything along the way, but after you destroy the nest heart, you can pick up some loot before the timer runs out and you get kicked out of the nest. Mostly the nests are boring. I just never found a reason to do these. They're not tied to the main story at all. The loot isn't anything you couldn't get everywhere else. And there's nothing about these that really feels important in any way, which makes doing them kind of feel like a waste of time. And I can't help but wish they had added some kind of reward that made it just more interesting to go do these things, because more than anything, nests feel like something arbitrary to give you something to do in co-op besides the main story. But a few other things to talk about in terms of exploration. For starters, we have the rooks. After a certain main story mission, everything you do will start contributing to what they call rook storms. Basically, when you complete main missions, kill special vampires, complete side missions, etc., you'll progress towards spawning the next rook. The rook being a large, dangerous enemy that is relatively difficult to deal with. However, much like a lot of this game, while the idea is sound, the execution is not. Rooks are dangerous if they get close to you, sure, but the problem is the second you realize how they work, it's very easy to get around them. So for starters, like everything else, they really struggle with pathfinding, and it's very easy to get them caught on things, even more so than a lot of other enemies, because rooks don't teleport as often. They teleport at set intervals, which makes them very formulaic to just destroy, provided you're not caught just completely out in the open. The other side of this, however, is that if you're having trouble beating a rook, you're in for a bad time because the game is inconsistent about despawning them. Once or twice, one would kill me and I would just be on my way and that would be it. The rook storm would pass. However, multiple times the rook storm persisted through my death. Like the second I left the safe house after the respawn, it would just immediately start up again and the rook would pop back in. And at that point, my curiosity was piqued. So I even Alt F4'd, exited out of the game completely, waited a while, came back, loaded in, and the rook storm continued even after all of that. And while, again, thankfully, it's easy to sort of break these guys in terms of what they're able to do with their AI and pathfinding, that certainly sets you up for a situation where you might have a real bad time if you don't know how to do those things. Though I admit that's probably going to be a niche case. And then, as I mentioned much earlier, as you explore, you can find grave locks, which are a collectible that will tell you more about the main story, so I don't want to spoil too much. But they're the main collectible you'll be picking up out and about. And beyond that, the rest of the world and exploration is very much so what you would expect. You're going to be scrounging various materials, which include things like lockpicks, rewire kits, which lets you get into various places, hack things, disarm tripwires, etc. So there's a little bit of interactivity there, and then most everything else that you pick up outside of weapons is going to basically just give you money that you can then spend either to replenish your supplies or buy new weapons. Every time you die, you also lose a little bit of this, but it's so abundant it just never really mattered. You might think that I didn't enjoy the world section or the exploration, and you would be wrong. Actually, what I think this game does best is when you are exploring of your own free will and there's no objective associated with it. The towns of Redfall, the areas are very well done. There's all these notes you can find that sort of give a little bit of environmental storytelling about what happened. There's secrets to find. There are side quests that can only be found by exploring the world. And when it's nighttime in this game and you're, again, just sort of stealthing your way through the place, it's incredibly atmospheric. And it is the one thing I think this game has going for it in spades. They crushed the atmosphere and the art direction. While stylized realism, which is what this is, might not necessarily be for everyone, I really enjoyed it. And it's a shame that that world and environment is let down by game mechanics that don't really serve it very well. Last but not least, though, for this particular section, I want to talk about stealth. Or rather, the lack of stealth. Technically, you can crouch and sneak around enemies, that is very true. The problem is that you have no silent way of taking down enemies. Or at least not for very long, which means later in the game, while it tries to present stealth as an option, it's kind of not really unless you just plan on not engaging in combat at all. And for a game that tries to tell you multiple times to take the stealth route, the game overall is much more of a run-and-gun experience. There's just not a lot of opportunities to do stealth, and even when you do, it's almost certainly going to devolve into a firefight at some point. So in terms of world and gameplay, there's a few things I think that would make this better. One, just more variation, period, in your enemy models, your side missions, your side quests, the implementation of a proper stealth system that actually contributed something. And while all of those problems pale in comparison to the combat itself and the issues it has, I do think with a few minor tweaks that are very possible, they could make this more interesting. And given the game's atmosphere and how everything works when you're running around at night trying to avoid vampires, etc., I think they could turn that into a compelling experience that right now it simply is not. That, though, does bring us to our Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this thing up a bit. So for starters, with the Steam Deck, it has a verified rating on Steam. However, that of course doesn't change the rest of the game by any means, but if you want to play this on the Steam Deck, it is a remarkably good experience in terms of the performance on that machine, because it has full controller support, cloud saves, and when you fire this game up in the game mode on the Steam Deck, it comes with a sort of custom graphic setting for the Steam Deck that feels perfect. This game played phenomenally well on the Steam Deck in terms of performance. However, again, not really going to change the more mechanical issues the game has, but in terms of raw performance, yeah, it works very well on the Steam Deck, though as I'm sure you've noticed, I don't have any footage on screen, and this is because some games really hate being recorded on the Steam Deck, which was the case here. But otherwise, honestly, no complaints. It felt very great. I wouldn't really personally like playing a game like this on the Steam Deck just because FPS in general with a controller is just almost impossible for me, but nonetheless, very good experience. That, though, does bring us to our positives, negatives, and then our conclusion. So on the positive side of things, we have the world itself and the art direction. Those two things for me were a lot of fun to explore. Despite the game's mechanical shortcomings, exploring the towns at play here, reading about what happened to everyone, seeing how that feeds into various secrets and side quests you can find out there was a lot of fun. It's when this game was at its best, and it's when I was having a good time. And that combined with the art direction for me was fantastic. I loved the art of this game, and while that's not the kind of thing that's ever going to be universal for a lot of people, I personally really enjoyed it. But on the flip side of that, we have our negatives. And while I could sit here and list out every various issue I've already been over multiple times, I think the easiest way to sum up the negatives for this game is that there are a lot of systems that feel unfinished. It feels like the concept is there, they're on the right track, but the iteration is not the right one. There are so many systems throughout this video that I've mentioned that I also tried to mention little tweaks that I think would make them better, because the idea is sound, the execution is not. Though, having said that, the big thing I do want to mention here in terms of the negative is the combat. While what you do feels great, what enemies do is just on two sides of the extremes. It is hands down the biggest problem this game has. And you're either dealing with enemies that are so incompetent it's almost hilarious, or you're dealing with enemies that are killing you from off screen and you don't even know what happened, and there's just not a lot of in between. And if it were me at Arcane, that would be priority number one. All of that does bring us to our conclusion. My conclusion for Redfall is simply that the game strikes me as a bit unfinished. I don't think it's nearly as bad as people are making it out to be, but at the same time, it does absolutely have a lot of issues. However, I do think with some tweaks and some rebalancing, etc., this game could get to a point where it's a lot of fun, because there's a lot of things it does right, or it comes incredibly close to doing right, but in its current form, it's just not there. And while that creates a situation where it's very easy to say how terrible this game is, and it's the worst game ever, etc., etc., I don't think that's very helpful. And if you were expecting that out of this review, then clearly you don't watch my channel very much. So, while at the same time I admit that this game isn't where it needs to be, and much of the current conversation around the state of it is very much so warranted, at the same time I want to acknowledge that while, yes, this game absolutely should have launched without all these issues are very much so salvageable. If you create anything and you're afraid of it failing or the public perception of it being poor, then it's not something you should be doing. Yes, the game had a bad launch. Now, where do you go from here? How do you change that? How do you apply it to your future titles? What do you do? Because for someone who is truly passionate about something, that's how you approach it. If every company or person just stopped doing something because they failed, nothing would ever get done. That is not how you grow, that is not how you change, that's not how you improve. And on that exact note, that makes problems with the enemies and the combat even that more frustrating, because this was the exact issue that came up with Deathloop. So to see that repeated here with a lot of other systems that also feel unfinished makes it a very frustrating title, because if you spend a lot of time with this game, say the time it takes to 100% it, you can see that the passion is there, the bones of a good game are here, and ultimately the final product fails to deliver on that. So if I was working at Arcane or anybody associated with the launch of this game, really, what I would be doing, and honestly what I do when one of my videos fails, is take stock of the why, apply from that feedback what you can into your own processes, fix what you can, and move on. However, at the same time, on a consumer level, in terms of a raw game recommendation, luckily, this game is on Game Pass, which makes trying it out for yourself relatively risk-free if you have Game Pass. However, if you are like me and would prefer to own all of your games, I would definitely say wait for sale on this one. And that's primarily because they are charging the full AAA price of almost $70 now, and whatever that amounts to regionally. And I think you'd be crazy to pay that price right now. You just would. This feels like a $30, $40 game at most. And at the end of the day, even if they get all of those things fixed up, they change it and this game eventually becomes great, I still wouldn't recommend paying full price for this, because at the end of the day, games shouldn't be launching in this state. It's unfortunate, you absolutely should get up and move on from it when it happens, but at the same time, personally, I wouldn't want to pay $70 for this, and it never should have launched like this at the end of the day, which makes it impossible to recommend in terms of a purchasing decision. So in that regard, I would say wait for a sale or try it out on Game Pass, which removes a lot of that risk anyway. But if they get a lot of that stuff fixed and you can catch it on sale for like $30, $40, I think you could have a good time with it. But in its current state, it feels unfinished. So with all of that said and with all of that in mind, I hope everyone involved in this assesses why all this went down, takes the appropriate steps to correct it, and goes on to make something that much better. That, however, is going to do it for me, so I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.